Welcome to Breaking Down Patriarchy. I'm Amy McPhie Allebest. To kick off today's episode, I'm going to read a section of a poem from Dr. Brendan Kwiatkowski-Hartman, who is a men's educator. He writes, "When I was 16, my best friend and I worked at a summer camp as counselors. One morning, our friend told us she had had a weird dream about us. In her dream, we were a married couple, and one of us was pregnant with our child. But me and my best friend were both boys and not gay. And the last thing we wanted, even in a dream, was to be the one with the child. Because then that would have meant we were even more girly. And when you're trying to be a man, girly just won't do. So that dream started a real life competition about who was less feminine than the other. For the next 8 years, when one of us would do something feminine, the other would say, 'See, he's more feminine than I am.' It was an ongoing joke. I viewed the feminine like it was contagious. And the best way to protect against it was to find someone who had it more. People laughed. We laughed. So I guess that meant it was all harmless." As you can imagine, this behavior is not harmless. Dr. K. Hartman goes on to write about how this fear of the feminine or of being gay has continued haunting boys and men around him his entire life, in some instances, even claiming their lives. Clearly, there is a need for intervention, for a serious conversation about masculinity and how we can protect our sons, our husbands, and our neighbors from this dangerous loneliness and this performative masculinity and all other damages of patriarchy. And to help us understand the situation better and more critically, what we can do about it, I'm excited to welcome to the podcast researcher and educator, Dr. Brendan K. Hartman. Welcome, Brendan.
Hi, Amy. Thanks so much for having me.
I am so excited to have you here. I've discovered your work on social media, and you are so wise and bring so much wisdom to this conversation. You're like exactly who I've been looking for. I think for years I've been looking for really men who are researching men's issues. So I'm super excited to have you here. I'm going
Thank
to
you.
read yeah. Thanks so much for being here today. I'm going to read your professional bio first, and then I'll have you introduce yourself more personally afterwards. Brendan Kwiatkowski-Hartman is a researcher, speaker, consultant, and educator specializing in the social, emotional development, and well-being of boys and men, also focusing on how this intersects with the well-being of others. His interdisciplinary research spans psychology, sociology, and education. In 2023, Brendan earned his PhD in education from the University of Edinburgh with a study on the emotions, masculinities, and schooling experiences of Canadian teenage boys. As a mixed methods researcher, Brendan firmly believes in positive focused and person-centered research. His approach seeks to humanize and empower participants, giving voice to their lived experiences. He's dedicated to making academic knowledge accessible to all, as well as conducting research that is transformative and practically useful in the real world. I also have to say now, after reading this bio too, since I'm a PhD student myself right now in education, this is so refreshing to read. One frustration I have when I study whatever it is, whether it's gender or race or class or whatever, sometimes the research doesn't ever leave academia, and it's not able to benefit people in their practical everyday lives. That's a massive frustration for me, and it's one of the things I feel like I'm called to do, is to fling open the doors of the ivory tower and get the information into people's actual homes and relationships so we can benefit from it. So kudos to you.
I appreciate that so much, and just had an experience in a New Jersey taxi fairly recently where the taxi driver, he had no clue what I do or what. He was just blaming academics for the current state of the world for not translating their knowledge more effectively and communicating it to the public at large.
Wow.
So yeah, it's definitely something that transferring knowledge from the ivory tower outward is so important.
It's so important. That's amazing that a taxi driver in New Jersey was even thinking about that, right? I know it's a frustration of mine just because that's where I live is kind of on that that in-between space between the academy and doing public education. But that's amazing that just everyday people are thinking about it too. That's so fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. And then he dropped me off at Princeton. And I was like, wait. He's like, who are you?
Oh, that's so funny. He didn't know the audience. Yeah, that's very funny. Okay, well, Brendan, if you can start by just telling us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and kind of like some key elements of your childhood and education, and kind of what brought you to study the subject that you study now and do the work you do.
Absolutely. So I grew up near Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. Still am there today. And oh, the most core level of like, how did I get into this? And I think it has to just be that I was aware of pain in the world, and it was easier for me to look at other people's pain than my own. I think actually for the first while. And so it's like, oh, I want to reduce pain in the world was probably like a childhood thing, but extended as I became a high school teacher. My one of my favorite students in my second year teaching died from suicide. And that was an impactful experience. And then I did my master's in special education, focused on students with in Canada, there's they call it like behavioral needs. In the States, maybe emotional behavioral disorders. Don't love the terminology, but you got issues relating to mental health. And then I came across the stat that 81% of students diagnosed with emotional and behavioral disorders were male. And I was a biology teacher and a history teacher prior to that. And so I was like, okay, how much of this is biology? How much of this is socialization? And that got me into the study of the pressures around masculinity. But there's so many different layers and different levels. Like there's a saying in social sciences that all research is me search. And I've found that to be more and more true. So even though, sure, wanting to help uh, teenage boys that were struggling, that's definitely one of the main reasons why I got into this. But also just seeing like, oh, as I interview more and more teenage boys, they have given me a mirror to better understand my childhood. And like I would have looked from the outside as like a fairly successful teenage boy um, from most standpoints. Like I was the good kid. I grew up evangelical Christian. Like I was the. This sounds cocky, and maybe it's not meant cocky at all. It's like I was the people pleaser,
Mm,
that I did what everyone wanted to, and so I think part of that, my draw towards some male students who were okay pushing authority, like kind of was like, oh, they were living a teenage lifestyle that I didn't get to have. But I just see all the ways in which we get disconnected from authentic parts of ourselves. And I guess I see that causing so much pain and suffering. And yes, I'd love to help other people, but I also don't view my own journey as separate from that. Like the way that I can help other people is also looking in the mirror. I often say that like my mission or what I want to do is like I want to create windows so that people can more clearly see and humanize other people's lived experiences, as well as mirrors so that they can more understand their lived experiences and not operate out of the painful restrictive narratives.
beautiful. Well, interestingly, I mean, we started the episode with an excerpt from a poem that you wrote, I think, from when you were a teenager, right? So that leads me to ask, when did you start to kind of analyze gender? Was that already something you were thinking about
My
as
first
a teen?
memory is around 7 to 12 years old,
Hmm.
somewhere in that time period, in church. I remember looking at the church bulletin, and they would like list who the pastors are of a specific church. And I had a regular church, but would sometimes go to other ones. And I remember asking my mom one Sunday, "Is like, why for the children's pastor? Why is it sometimes children's pastor or sometimes children's coordinator?" And it's like, oh, if it's a woman, it's a children's coordinator because women aren't allowed to be pastors. And so that's like my earliest memory of like gender as having real world role differences
Hmm.
in that. But I also went to a father son fishing trip when I was in that time period as well. And that's when me and my cousin, who were like brothers growing up, developed something called the Manly Way, which was like a game mainly based on physical strength, where we'd go like a more dangerous route or like jump across a ditch or climb a tree and be like, this is the manly way, and like encourage each other to do that. So like there was these scripts that were quite present in a lot of my play from
Hmm.
quite a young age.
Yeah, and so I mean, lots of content to dig into now that you have the lenses you do now, right? To look back on your past. I know that's definitely true for me too. Um, okay, so let's start with a really basic question. Um, it's It's probably more complicated than people think, though. I'm going to ask you, what is masculinity? How would you define it? And is your definition sort of the agreed upon definition that most people would use, or has your definition evolved as you've studied it?
I think my definition is actually quite agreed upon. What is disagreed upon is what is the cause of that definition. So let me explain. So I said masculinity are beliefs, behaviors, and roles commonly associated with the male sex. But where we have disagreements of like, are these things commonly associated with the male sex because they are biological in nature, they're spiritual in nature, or socially constructed in nature? And so often in academia, they present it as a continuum between biological essentialism, which is more rigid and like it's biologically tied. And then you can have a continuum all the way up to social constructionism, which at its most extreme would say biology is irrelevant to the conversation around masculinity and it's all socially constructed. But I prefer a Venn diagram where it's biology, social constructionism, and spiritual reality, because I find that that kind of describes where I interact with people, especially on the ground, of like, yeah, there's a biology component to a lot of people's beliefs, but often that's tied into a spiritual belief. But then some spiritual beliefs can be quite more flexible and like more like Carl Jungian would have like an anima and animus, that there's a feminine inside the masculine and masculine inside the feminine. And so those things aren't so necessarily tied to one's biological sex, which is much more closer to social constructionism as a flexible framework. So I feel like where we disagree, or where everyone kind of disagrees on, is does their own sense of masculine or feminine identity, what is the overlap of those three circles? And then do you think that everyone else in society has to have the same overlap of those circles for what masculinity is or isn't? So that's kind of how I conceptualize it. But generally speaking, people agree it's beliefs, behaviors, and roles commonly associated with the male sex,
Mm-hmm.
but they disagree on why that is.
Yeah, that's a really helpful framework. And one thing that I just thought uh, is how difficult it is to have a conversation with someone who does have a different um, definition or attribution to where those masculine norms come from. And like I really liked how you phrased the question, like, what's your framing? And then does everybody need to agree on it? And maybe that's even useful when you are going into a conversation with someone. If you know, for example, that they have a firm belief that it's pretty much all biological, but that biological difference comes from God, like that we have like a spiritual essence that is either masculine or feminine. I come from the Mormon tradition,
Mm.
and that's doctrinal for LDS people, that even like your soul, not even embodied, an embodied soul is a man or a woman.
Mm.
And so you're born into a body there that matches your spirit. And if somebody has that like strong and strict of a definition, it's just good to know that going into a
Absolutely.
conversation, because you may not be able to agree or to find common ground
Yeah.
if it's that rooted in doctrine, right?
Absolutely. And I think where we see more polarization, and I very much ascribe to, I don't want to belong to any ism that doesn't have the capacity for self-critique.
Mm.
And so to critique something that I still like agree with is that I think sometimes people who are far more in the social constructionism camp, um, they treat the conversation as if it's like a decided fact and people are not even close to there, and then it doesn't even bring
Yeah.
the conversation to anything meaningful or helpful. And
Hmm.
so it might be helpful just to like quickly illustrate for the audience, like if you do cross cultural studies of like what are the most common gender roles that most societies believe about men, and there's two in common, that men are protectors and providers.
Mm-hmm.
And so, from a biological standpoint, they would look at those protectors and providers and see, like, okay, because biologically, men have on average greater height, greater muscle mass, that gives them more connection to the roles of provider and protector. Then, from a social constructivist standpoint, you say, oh, it's all about how we construct protection and provision, that we view nowadays protection to be like physical protection. But then if you look at stats of like what is the most threat to pregnant women, it's like gunshot wounds from men in general. So it's like, okay, well, that's not protecting. So like how we define protecting and provision greatly changes how we view things. Because you could say that a mother breastfeeding is providing tons of nurturing care
Yep.
and life sustenance. So it's like, how do we define these terms changes how we understand them. And then from a spiritual standpoint, they look at protecting and providing, and they could have like a more rigid one would be like, okay, like basically the church that I grew up in, which actually that church did end up changing some of their theology around, but it's like, okay, women can't be pastors. And so that would be like a spiritual belief. But then you could also have, I know a lot of people who like their spirituality is like, I have both masculine and feminine energy. So like I'm stepping into my masculine power of leadership. And then there's feminine leadership. Like there's like infinite ways that people conceptualize masculine and feminine energies. So that's kind of like some examples of how people's beliefs would interplay based on where they are on that Venn diagram.
Yeah, I'm loving this. And actually, not to get stuck on this one very first question, but this is so useful, I think, for listeners too, because I mean, my first assessment was like, yeah, if the person is super rigid and firm and it's from religious dogma, there's just not much you can do. But I think I want to amend what I said based on your response to that. I think it's just good to know where they are and then see if there's something that you can relate to in that, and like see what might be proximal to where they already believe. What I'm thinking here is when you said people who are purely constructivists, and I find this typically with like younger people who don't even want to acknowledge like any typical differences between sexes. This is my experience with like Gen Z and stuff, which is fine, but then you just like, you're never going to have a productive conversation if you're both kind of dogmatic in those beliefs.
Yeah.
So I find it useful. I love how you're framing this to see like, okay, I see where they are, how they're defining what masculinity is. I can see what like might be a baby step to get them to consider something different. Like, oh, there's research, there's data that shows it's actually at least partly socially constructed. Or from the other side too, like there's data that shows, or like, what do you make of typical physical differences, and be able to acknowledge where they're coming from. And then also, I don't know, I'm just thinking of strategic kind of like methods to try to have productive conversations about this, because it's so hard.
I'm so glad that this is resonating, because that's like my hope in like creating frameworks that connect people, or make it easier for them to operate on understanding, and like, and this is not just exclusive to teenage boys, but I do think some of my work on the ground with teenage boys is like the worst thing to really do to ever like try to change people is to come in with an agenda trying to change people.
Yep, totally.
So just understanding and seeing that like, yeah, my agenda in any conversation, and I'm not a pure social constructionist, I'm somewhere along the continuum personally, but understand that some people's identities would be that way and can hold space for that easily. It's like my agenda would be, from a well-being perspective regarding anything, is to move away from pure rigidity.
Mm-hmm.
So just become a bit more flexible
Mm-hmm.
in your beliefs, wherever those are.
That's great. Well, I mean, as we're kind of talking around this issue, this conversation can be so charged, right? So I'm curious, as in your research and your experience as an educator, why does it tend to bring out so much defensiveness and a lot of big emotions, especially I think for boys and men when it's discussed?
Yeah, I'm going to give you another framework, see if you like this one as much. It's from, I come to it from an author, Richard Rohr, who has a book called The Wisdom Pattern.
Mm-hmm.
And you're nodding. Do you know Richard Rohr? Okay.
I know Richard Rohr, yeah.
Okay. So basically, a lot of societies use different language. But the language I really like is like, people and societies go through stages of order, disorder, and reorder. And The problem is when any stage gets isolated from the other. And healthy reorder understands that this process is going to continue multiple times. Because as soon as you get to like a reordered, or some people use like learning, unlearning, and relearning, you can become just as tyrannical and fundamentalist as the previous order, and then you become the new order. And so, um, why are things so polarized is because I think there's so many different ways to tackle this. um, some of my favorite research to describe this is that a study was done in 2023 from the think tank Equimundo that men who are more in rigid man box, which is more restrictive ideals around masculinity, and these things are proven to be like worse for boys and men's well-being as well as for other people's well-being the more you adhere to them, but they also indicated a higher sense of purpose in life. And uh, having a sense of purpose in life is one of the best benefits of the reorder stage. Order allows a sense of purpose, a clarity. Growing up in a church with very clear gender roles made it very clear, and I fit into a lot of them. So it made it like very seamless, and it wasn't much of a challenge for me. It provided that stability. And then disorder comes around, and I would say sociologically, feminism, especially second and third wave feminism, was a huge disorder from disrupting like the harmful aspects of tyranny that happen in order. And the benefit of disorder is that it diversifies, but if you stay in a prolonged state of disorder, it can create meaninglessness and purposelessness. And so I think that we are on the precipice, or we're just very much societally stuck in a state of disorder where we don't have an adequate reorder for men, and so men are trying to go back to the order that was there. Or and then like one of my favorite things to talk about is like our relationship with emotions, and I think there's something very comparable here, is that, or they'd be like, okay, there were some harmful aspects of masculinity, but we want to skip over the disorder stage, and one of the disorder stages is just acknowledging the pain that happened in order. And so we want to bypass that, like a spiritual bypass or emotional bypass of that, and just get to the reorder, but we're not like necessarily taking full accountability of the harm, and understanding the importance of the disorder stage. And we just kind of want to recreate just a different order. And so people get defensive because they have found value in different stages. So just like people are defensive of disorder because it took away these gender roles that were just very clear and straightforward and made sense and provided security and safety, which order definitely does. You also have people that uh, you have people that have strong reactions to any stage because each stage requires a huge leap of faith and trust, and people's shame responses are so high because it means like, wait, you didn't experience benefits from this stage, like but you're not acknowledging that I experienced benefits from this, and so you're saying that like the way that I was bad. And I guess this happens anytime that humans, the more likely humans are to make one aspect of their identity tied into who they are, then we start losing perspective. And it's like, okay, any critique becomes a critique of me. And then it becomes so much harder to actually have a conversation.
That so resonates with me. And I can see how that that longing to go back to where everything felt safe and like a boy grew into a man, knowing what he was supposed to do, how to succeed as a human being, how to be a quote unquote good man, that worked for a lot of boys and men, right? And so it's scary. Change is scary for people. And then it can turn into a zero-sum game, right? Where the disorder stage where women are like, but that didn't work for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so this other thing works for me. And then men can feel like everything's being taken away from them because they haven't been given a new. Yeah, I'm just
Yeah.
summarizing what you said, but that
Well,
makes so much sense to
like
me.
existentially,
Yeah.
to stay in disorder is an existentially difficult position. Like
Yeah.
to be in a state of meaninglessness,
Yeah.
or like if you, it's a hard sell to be like, you have to let go of your purpose for a bit until you find a new one.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not an easy place for humans to be in.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes there's like that you let go, and it can take a generation or two for society to figure out how they're going to reorder. And that's an entire person's lifetime sometimes, or
Mm-hmm.
it's like as if it's phase of when they're like a preteen going into their adulthood, and that's the stage where society's let go of the old stuff, and they don't know what to grab onto. I can totally see how that can describe maybe what a lot of boys and men are experiencing right now, just that
Yeah.
terror of what do I grab onto then, right?
Yeah. I think individually, there's some great examples that have done it, but like collectively, I think
Mm-hmm.
we're definitely floundering in that
Mm-hmm.
regard. And I'll speak just to share my own experience is that I went into my PhD and masculinity did matter to me, but during my PhD, I kind of had this arrogant notion where I was like, you know what? There's a big debate in the field about whether we even encourage positive masculinity or just positive humanness.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was like, you know what? Like, masculinity doesn't matter to me. Like, it's just humanness. And I felt
Mm-hmm.
like that was a disorder stage, and like there was some beauty in that. But the longer that I stayed in that, like, I thought I was like kind of evolved past caring about this. But then, like, especially near the end of my PhD, I was like, this isn't working. And like, I basically had like a reclamation process after my PhD of like, no, masculinity actually still does really matter to me. And so there was like that reordering, relearning stage of like, oh, I can own that I like having a masculine identity.
Mm-hmm.
Even though the way that I conceptualize that, uh, I don't even love like getting into the nitty gritty about what it actually means. I just know it means something to me, and this would be like a part of my spiritual beliefs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love that you're sharing this. That I just posted a video on masculinity on my YouTube channel, and that's what we ended with, is like those two modalities of like you can, and to some people they do want to hang on to that. It's really important to my husband. Like masculinity, a healthy masculinity is really important to him. And to some people, they're like, masculinity and femininity is completely made up. Just be a good human. Exactly to your point. And I think where I've landed is like, yeah, to some people it matters a lot, and to some people it doesn't. So just look at like how to be a healthy human and what matters to you. It kind of reminds me of race. Like we have a lot of friends of many different races, but specifically Black friends, where we know Black families for whom their identity as Black Americans is like core, so
Mm-hmm.
so so important to them. And then we have other Black friends that are like, it's just melanin. Like every human being has a different amount of melanin in their skin, and that identity, that racial identity, is not as important to them. And in my opinion, like that's great. Like that's great either way. Just
Yeah.
living in the way that feels like authentic and healthy to you is like there's enough room for that.
Yeah, having room for that is so important. It reminds me, like, my background in special education is like having a label. Is that a freeing thing or is that a cage? And for
Mm,
different people, it's a different relationship, and that relationship can actually change over time, and they don't have to be locked in all at the same time.
yeah.
But absolutely, I I, I resonate with that, and I resonate with that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, next topic. On your website, you list masculinity's core tenets, and the very first one on the list. Well, I don't know if this is the way I'll say this. Let me rephrase that. Okay. On your website, I noticed that the phrase "the status quo isn't working," and so I'd love to know what's wrong with the status quo for boys and men. However we define masculinity, something isn't working. We've just talked about kind of boys and men maybe being in a free fall and not knowing what, you know feeling a foundation under them. So how would you respond to those who might think, and I've heard women say this recently, like, sorry, I don't have any pity like for boys and men, they have so much privilege and power, like, stop complaining. So how would you respond to them, and tell us why the status quo isn't working for boys and men?
Yeah, I'll answer the status quo first.
Okay.
So the status quo isn't working, I would argue, for anyone.
Mm-hmm.
So like from a well-being perspective, like especially in the States, there's a lot more research about that. But like things are getting more polarized with Gen Z. It's like the most politically divided of any generation in American history. It's the most romantically, relationally divided. Um, and mental health issues are rising, and that's a lot of it does track with social media, but social media also plays a huge role in messages around gender as well. So like from a mental health perspective, things aren't doing great for anyone. And so the status quo of, I guess it goes back to the order, disorder, reorder. Like the status quo is just really for it's fighting for isolated order, disorder, and there's not really much space for what you talked about, like holding the tension that there's different journeys. And like the thing is, the main approach that I always enter these conversations that tries to also just like lower the temperature in the room is from a well-being perspective. So if I talk about masculinity, like the three most harmful traits of masculinity from a well-being perspective uh, are need to suppress emotions, need to be hyper independent, and need to be dominant over others. But I also believe that all human behavior makes sense in the context in which it arises. And so um, I always in my workshops like get boys and men to defend these things. Like, what did that provide? What did that protect? What was the advantage of that? But like, I think as humans, one of the constant things to reassess is, are we still in survival mode? And you have people like Andrew Tate who say like life is like the real world is a war, and it's a fight for the woman that you want, for the money, for the power. Like, so that mentality is really hard. Like that's probably the hardest message to change, is the need to be dominant, because you have a lot of examples of dominance in this world where like there's always going to be people fighting for dominance in this world. So like takes a huge paradigm shift. And so like those three rigid and restrictive messages aren't working. But I also think that sometimes the conversation isn't great, because we talk about like emotional suppression being one of the most harmful things. And we don't understand that like the reasons why, in my PhD research, the reasons why all teenage boys started to restrict their emotions made so much sense for the context in which they were in. And like it prevented them from being bullied. It did all these protective things. Or like the people in their lives did not have the capacity to handle their emotional vulnerability, or they got super burnt by it. So it's like it makes sense in that context. And so I think sometimes the conversation can, like the status quo around the conversation also isn't working, because we want people to change, to heal, but we're getting into a state where it's way more into suffering contests of like, you think you're in pain over here? No, my pain. Like I've seen suicide statistics being weaponized, and like I'm super wanting to prevent suicides for all genders, but like I am specifically focused on preventing suicides for boys and men.
Mm-hmm.
But like I like so quickly those stats can be weaponized of like, you think you're in more pain over here, I'm in more pain over here. And so then to answer the question of like, what would I do to people who respond of like, why do I care about, I shouldn't care about boys and men's loneliness epidemic or anything that's going on with boys and men's mental health, I would first understand, like how I would view that is understanding that like I don't think that their lived experience and their pain has been witnessed and held, so it's way harder to have capacity to hold someone else's. And this goes back to another model that I really love using, is called the trauma triangle. In psychology, it was referred to as the drama triangle, but I don't like that name because drama is often associated with how girls and women interact. So I think trauma triangle is just more generous of why people are on the different stages of the triangle, which is like an unhelpful cycle of people in roles of villain, victim, and hero. And when people get stuck in these roles, like we have the problem is rigidity. Like the problem with almost all of these things is rigidity, when we only view people or certain groups of people as being able to be villains, victims, or heroes. And so like I kind of like, if they are lacking empathy towards boys and men, I feel two things. I feel like non-empathy is not a viable or a helpful approach in my book, but I also hold that I don't think that they've been seen or held or witnessed in their pain.
Mm-hmm.
So if I could wave a magic wand in the world, it would be to increase our capacity to handle the emotional distress of ourselves and of others.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would want to handle, and hopefully that they can be seen and witnessed as far as I'm able to, and that eventually that will also help them be able to see and witness other people's pain, boys and men's pain. And so it's like this dance of people in pain trying to give as much space as possible to other people in pain, and showing up in the greatest capacity we have to hold as many people as possible in pain without denying our own pain. And so it's just a dance
Mm-hmm. I
that I
could
would
not
want to
agree
acknowledge.
more. No, yeah, that's I think that's absolutely true. That's how I feel is on both sides, people who just want to go to arguing and outdoing the other person in how much pain they've experienced. Somebody has to stop that cycle and just say, okay, you know what, I'm going to be the first one to listen and then to
Yeah,
validate. Yeah.
something that I want to extend that and also clarify is, one, I often say, like, pain isn't fair, but I don't think healing is fair either. Like, it's
Mm-hmm.
not fair that sometimes the real life victim
Mm-hmm.
heals first and that helps the real life perpetrator.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's not fair.
Mm-hmm.
And that sucks. And just acknowledging that. And I also want to clarify that you can take this victim triangle and use it like a trauma triangle, and be like, okay, everyone's in pain. Everyone just needs to let each other go. But that's that spiritual or emotional bypassing as well. That's why, like, I want to live in a world where we are able to handle the emotional dysregulation of other people, that, like, we don't have to tone police everyone, but we can, like, understand, like, okay, people are angry, people are hurt, people are mad, and rather than, like, dismissing that or be like, you just need to get along. Like, I don't want to force anyone along that pattern. I do hope, for their own sake and for others' sake, that we can get to a place where we humanize other people. But I guess, yeah, I guess trying to be in a state of reorder is recognizing that we're all on this process. And as soon as you think that you're superior because you're in reorder, then you've lost it. Then
Mm-hmm.
you're back in that ordered place. Sometimes
Mm-hmm.
say this is so much easier theoretically than, like, in person. Like, when my wife expresses her anger, because women tend to be socialized out of externalized expressions of anger, it's like, on a sociological level, I'm celebrating when women's rage and anger gets externalized. But on a human level too, it's like, oh, it's hard for me sometimes to sit in my wife's anger.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the tension.
Mm-hmm. There, yep, there it is. I'm wondering too, as I'm thinking about it, I like that you point out that it's really unfair. And especially, I think there's this sense for women of the historical injustices. I mean, when you look at the harms that patriarchy has done to women since really time immemorial, and there's like inherited intergenerational trauma that we're just always aware of, to our mothers, our grandmothers, our great, all the way back. There's um, this sense of kind of the injustice of it, to like, and now I am going to have to sit here and I have to be the first one to listen and I have to be the one to do the work to help the man heal. And I think one thing that can be help, well, I think one thing that's changing the conversation and making at least what I'm saying women able to care more is because this is affecting our sons. It's affecting young boys, and that this crisis, this mental health crisis, is affecting children. And I think that can be a safer place to start, um, to have empathy for children and recognizing like, oh, I can tend to children, and that sometimes can open up a door in women who I think understandably do have so much rage, like you said, and thank you for honoring that. And they might not be able to go to their dad and be a good listener to their dad about how their dad is struggling, but they'll be able to with their son, and that can open a door to be able to say, yeah, actually I can sit with pain too. But yeah, it's not fair. It's not fair for women to be asked to do that necessarily, when you look at it from a structural, systemic, historical point of view.
Well, yeah,
It's rough.
exactly, because that actually just replicates the trauma triangle of the hero. The hero, like, steps into a role of helping the person. So if they think that, like, men aren't capable of their emotions or things like that, that's very patronizing, actually, I think, of men. But also, for the hero role, if women are forced to do this emotional labor and more
Mm-hmm.
emotional work, that builds up resentment. And that isn't
Mm-hmm.
actually, it's like, the whole goal is to be aware of where you are and to get off the triangle. And there's different things
Mm.
that each role, if you're stuck in one role, would need to be aware of. And I could go into all of them, but for essentially, like, it's a world of difference between a woman who feels like they should or that they need to be the emotional safe haven for a boy or man in their life.
Mm.
There's a world of difference between that and between women who are choosing, like, this is how I want to show up. And a theme in my research was women as emotional safe havens, which is the majority, not all, but the majority of the teenage boys felt like they could be most emotionally vulnerable with a woman in their lives, a girlfriend or a mother. And I did a TikTok that went fairly viral about this, asking women like, what did they feel about their experiences of being an emotional safe haven? And by far the most comments were like, I'm totally down for being it. I just hope that it becomes reciprocal at some point.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. That's very, very interesting. Okay, one other kind of phrase, like a soundbite that I'd love to have you talk about is toxic masculinity. And that has come up between me and my husband too. He now understands like that it doesn't mean that all masculinity is toxic, but that is definitely how it hit him, like for years. And I didn't realize that that's how he was hearing that phrase. Um, but my understanding is that you just don't like using that and you'd prefer something else instead. What are your thoughts on the word toxic?
I'm going to answer this from a place I've never answered it before. Let's see how it works. Growing up as a Christian, the most harmful theology belief that I internalized was the belief that I was inherently bad, evil, sinful at my core.
Mm.
And unlearning that message, and like there's totally different doctrines, doctrine of total depravity. That was definitely the one that I grew up in. I talked to my dad about this a couple years ago, and he was so confused. He was like, but like, yeah, sure, we taught you that, but like we also taught you that you were beautifully and wonderfully made as well. And it's like, okay, well, that's not what I took in. So like, I think sometimes we think that people can take in different things, but like the messaging around toxic masculinity, I have two very different opinions. Is that I have the reason why I don't use it is because I don't think it's effective from strategic reasons. I also don't think it's the most accurate of describing what's going on. I have no problem saying like certain specific actions are toxic, like believing in rape myths. Like, yeah, if you think someone wanted it, or like all these other things are how they were dressing, like that's a toxic belief for sure. But I think that um, there's a difference between boys hearing just a lot of negative messages around masculinity, where like the toxic sometimes, as a psychologist I work with a bit, told me one time, was like sometimes the toxic is just implied. It's like an invisible word, like masculinity becomes that way. And I know that like the feminist theory around it, or like I don't actually know if feminist theory started it, but anyways, the terminology around toxic masculinity was never meant that all masculinity is toxic, but that is still how a lot of people can interpret that. But I also think that the men who are telling young boys this are not being accountable to like the nuance of that conversation. Like I think that some of them are willfully misrepresenting the narrative around toxic masculinity. So I have a different standard or accountability for those men as I would for the men that are just hearing a lot of negative messages, or the boys internalizing these messages in a different way. And so I think that for better or for worse, like that term is not helpful to be used. And going back to what I said are the three most harmful aspects associated with masculinity. The upstream things are like emotional suppression, hyper independence, can't ask for anyone's help, and dominance. And so those three things, like I say, can lead to toxic behaviors. But if you take apart one of them, so like emotional suppression, the three main reasons why teenage boys suppress their emotions is fear of being judged, being seen as weak, fear of being a burden. They like care for people in their lives and they don't want to add to their stress. They're going through enough stuff as it is. And boys in my research both felt like those two reasons were connected to masculinity specifically. They didn't think the third reason was. The third reason was just that they had been emotionally close with someone in the past and that had ended, whether through death or just a best friend moving away suddenly. And they're like, I don't want to get emotionally close to someone again because that was painful enough the first time. So if we can be very clear about the terminology, that if they just hear like toxic masculinity and it's this kind of a broad sweep of like, it doesn't match their lived experiences of that being like actually very beneficial for their survival, or like that's what people in my life wanted, so it doesn't resonate. It's like, I guess that it's too broad of a brush, so I would just want people to be more specific about it. Like I'm not offended by the term, I just don't think it's effective.
Yeah. I think that's great. I think it's misunderstood often enough, or like you said, misrepresented as like a lightning rod, kind of like that maybe it's just not useful as a term.
Yeah, and I do think that positive identity formation is really important, especially
Mm-hmm.
developmentally for anyone. And so there is so many messages of ways not to be, which is like that unlearning stage. You need the unlearning stage, but I think boys are being raised without the order that's kind of developmentally more appropriate. They're kind of growing up in the disorder phase sociologically, and that um, creates more room for people to reach them with messages of like, this is a clear order.
Yeah.
Because if you ask teenage boys like why, in a study in Australia, it was like 36% of teenage boys view Andrew Tate as a role model. But then if you look at why do they view him as a role model, like some of the top reasons are that he's not afraid to say what he wants, and that like uh, he's like provides a clear outline of like, I want to be strong, so this is how I be strong. I want to make money, this is how I make money. So he's giving that clear, rigid order, and that makes sense in a world where messages around masculinity is more of an unlearning stage.
Yeah. Yeah. Very interesting. Kate, that just leads me to wonder what you would propose to build in that if we are trying to say like let's give boys and men positive messaging. Like what do we want instead? We don't want this old way of dominant and restrictive masculinity. It's disorienting to just keep living in the disorder. What would you propose for the next phase societally, and like what would that look like on an individual level too for boys and men?
That's such a great question, and I might have to, or maybe I'm writing a book about it. So
Awesome.
I need to have much more ample time to unpack that. But what you can't do is have one unilateral monolithic approach of the reorder stage. Like I'd love to live in a world where adult men have gone through order, disorder, and reorder so that boys can be raised in a order stage informed from that reorder.
Mm-hmm.
And so um, like I guess the movement looks from rigidity to how holding a bit more space. So a bit more space for discomfort. So whenever I hear these questions, and this is part of these types of questions are the most prominent. Like I do talks for parents, teachers, like what do we do? Like how do we actually do things? And yes, I have specific strategies, but there's also a desire of um, like I want to give people such tangible things because there's so much pain and there's so much need for it, but also like the more tangible it becomes is also becomes a bit more rigid,
Mm-hmm.
and that is kind of counterintuitive to what we're trying to go for here.
Mm-hmm.
And so like what I do think that some people's journeys to reorder will be positive humanness, and
Mm-hmm.
I think that for the majority of boys and men in the world, it will be a positive masculinity, which is more expansive. And so it is recognizing like my personal masculinity can be different than someone else's masculinity. So like in the research academically, this would be called multiple masculinities, is recognizing that there's multiple ways to be a man, and that there is encouragement along those ways. I would like there to be more openness that like boys don't feel ashamed for a masculine identity, and there is some, I do talk to boys that are like ashamed of like I don't know what I could be, so there's just room for humanness and for a masculine identity. And probably what I would characterize as the most like the what I would want the most reorder from a masculine identity perspective to be would be something that moves from performance to presence. Anything that connects us to the here and now, to our bodies. So if emotional suppression is like, let's say that started for a really good reason, for survival, like that was protective of right there, of right in that moment. But then if you continue suppressing, that's disconnecting you from yourself and from others. So it's always looking for ways in which your identity can bring you more into presence. Like I would say this about religious and spiritual beliefs as well, is that when things become most helpful is when they actually like increase your presentness in living in the world. And so things that like embodiment, like you might have heard this expression before of like almost anything can be a medicine or a drug depending on your intention. So
Mm-hmm.
working out, like being physically fit, absolutely can be a great medicine to embody people, but at the same time, it can be a drug, which is like increasing bigorexia, muscle dysmorphia, like rising rates of disordered eating amongst men and boys and men, and steroid use, gear use, all those things. It's like the tension of both. And I think, again, using a personal example, is that I like being athletic, but I took like a year off of working out to be like, okay, because I didn't know if I was working out because I hate myself or love myself.
Yeah.
And then where I've come to is like, oh, I don't think I need to be so black and white. It's like some days I'm working out because I'm not satisfied with my body, and some days I'm working out because I love my body, and I'm hoping to get to more days of loving my body.
Mm-hmm.
So like reorder, I think, is a lot more gray and holding the nuance. And uh, yeah, so reorder would look a lot more gray and
Mm-hmm.
gracious.
I love that. That's so interesting. Would it be fair to say also, like you identified those really harmful aspects of kind of what masculinity has been thought of traditionally, dominating over others, restricting emotions, like maybe subtracting those, and then you're still left with so many positive manifestations or choices of ways to be masculine, but just taking the bad out? Is that a valid way to look at it?
Yeah, absolutely. I should have mentioned that. Like just reframing those three things is like my actually supervisor got mad at me for keeping on using the word emotional stoicism
Mm,
because she's like, why do you keep on using stoicism? I was like, well, it's always in the research. She's like, go research like the history of stoicism, like the philosophy behind it.
mm-hmm.
And don't get me wrong, like Marcus Aurelius at the time was still also getting critiqued about like there was confusion about whether it's emotional suppression or whether it's not. And knowing when, like, and I would say that stoicism is largely misapplied by a lot of men
Mm-hmm.
who actually are just referring to emotional suppression. But I think stoicism is actually like a lot of traits of emotional intelligence, of being able to like feel and recognize the feelings and not be controlled by them. I think those are really good skills. And so you can have positive messages from the emotional suppression. You could actually, I don't know, this could get into a debate about whether it's helpful to reframe emotional stoicism, but like definitely reframing emotional intelligence and building emotional intelligence skills would be like being strong and sensitive, or vulnerability, seeing that as a strength, as a positive reframe. And then for hyper independence, self reliance is a really great thing, but we know that the need for community, the need for support from each other is like one of the best predictors of life satisfaction and a long life. And then the reframe for dominance is that I would describe dominance as power over, whereas if we go for power with or power for would be
Yeah.
the reframes there.
Yeah. Fantastic. Okay, well, we only have time for a couple more questions. I wanted to make sure to ask you about the show Adolescence. I just barely watched it. It took me a while to get to it because I was not up for it for a few months because I knew what it was about, and I'm so glad I watched it. I thought it was really important, really uh, well. I mean, incredible filming, well written, well acted. But it's a really harrowing story account of a 13-year-old boy who's found guilty of stabbing a female classmate to death. And it comes out that he's been influenced by the manosphere, a lot of really dangerous online rhetoric. And so I wanted to ask you specifically about what you thought of the show Adolescence, and also because we haven't really talked about the aspect of masculine, this strain in, especially right now, current, masculinist spaces that really is misogynistic and really denigrates, fears, and demeans women. So I wanted to hear about that kind of in general, and then what you thought of the show specifically.
I ended up writing a blog post about the reactions, my reaction to the reactions to the show
Mm.
Adolescence. So I'll start there.
Okay.
Is that I think there's a lot of fear that was increased, and I think I got a lot of DMs about like, this is my first introduction to the manosphere. Like, is this something I need to be aware of for my son or something like that? And I think that what I like most about that aspect is that absolutely the manosphere, but I would say more specifically than the manosphere, I think the red pilled aspect of the manosphere, like kind of like toxic masculinity, I think manosphere is a bit too broad and
Okay.
not exact, but the red pilled is very anti feminist, but very misogynistic, and very much back on the trauma triangle of of like men are the main victims, and women are the perpetrators. But also with like incel communities, they have women as the heroes as well. It's like they hate women and feminism particularly for the state of masculinity or men in the world today, but they also view women as like the heroes that can save them from their loneliness and from their needs, and can meet all their needs. So it's like a totally perfect example of the trauma triangle in action. So the show, I think, is really important for highlighting that teenagers are exposed to these red pilled messages. Absolutely. Like, I work in schools across North America. That is something that many schools approach me because they're noticing an increase in sexist talking points, in because of those communities. So absolutely, that's a thing. On the other side, like in the UK, there is saying like we need to show this to all students in schools. I do not think that's a good approach. I think that will actually backfire. But I think that there's some people that we can be so reactive from a fear-based lens that we see, like, I don't like it if it causes people to, okay. It's like always trying to wade these waters is that there's people who are like, this show just hates men or is like the war against boys and men even more. It's like, you should be having empathy for women who primarily women who are the sexist targets of a lot of red pill content. And at the same time, I don't want to dehumanize like boys and men. So if that show makes you dehumanize and be like, they're all just disgusting or all into this, it's like, sure, it's more complicated because, like, yeah, 36% of teenage boys in that one study in Australia view Andrew Tate as a role model. But how many of those see all this sexist talking points? That I would say is a smaller number, because I talk to teenage boys all the time, ones that hate Andrew Tate, and the majority of them do not like Andrew Tate, but they also can't escape his type of content online. And there's recent study just done on, like, if you're a teenage boy on social media on Snapchat, it's like, what was it, 30 seconds before you start seeing anti-woman content. And so they're being exposed to all of these things. Doesn't mean that they are liking all these things. I think probably one of the things that is most important to address is that, like, men tend to assume other men are more sexist than they are. And so if the silence around these things, if boys and men are silent and they hear like a sexist joke and then no one steps up to that, then they're going to think, okay, everyone else is okay with that. And then, like, the bar for what's sexist or not kind of keeps on going higher and higher and higher. And so that absolutely needs to be addressed. But I think that, there's so much nuance in the show. Like, for instance, the incel community, which is like involuntary celibate, like, that is the most, like, they're not red pilled, they're generally black pilled, which is a more nihilistic state. Like, their suicide rates are extremely high. Like, they're way more likely to harm themselves than others, like from a statistical standpoint. But saying all these things, like, I so quickly, depending on, like, I always just imagine what audience members listening to this and be like, okay, but they're the villains or they're the perpetrators. Like, I would say that the show is great for highlighting really important issues that need to be addressed, but I don't want it to just perpetuate trauma triangle dynamics.
Yeah, interesting. I did think that the show did a great job with nuance and, like, just presenting a wide range of behaviors, emotions, internal experiences. I felt a lot of, I mean, I hesitate even to say it, but this 13-year-old kid, and you care about him, and he's a child, and he did this horrific thing, but he's also a child, but the most striking character of all for me was Jamie's dad.
Mm-hmm.
Just the complexity that man had experienced in his life, the way the actor portrayed it. I do recommend that listeners watch it if you haven't yet.
Yeah, my favorite episodes 3 and 4.
Yep.
I think, yeah, I you know what, I realized I just answered that whole thing based on other people's perspectives, and that is such a people-pleasing thing of me to do. I should just answer it for myself. Is that, like, episode 3 and 4 particularly, I think there's so much important nuance on context. And absolutely what you mentioned is that audience members should pay attention to where they feel like their empathy or compassion is drawn to in any given moment, and sit in that tension. Like, that is the messiness of these issues. And yeah, I was in tears in that 4th episode so much.
Oh, me too. Yeah, my whole family was. Yeah, and the show does a pretty good job not being didactic either. It just shows you all the complexity, and you just have to sit with it, and then it's over. Like, it doesn't really try to make sense of it, which is something that I actually appreciated. But it leaves a lot of work up to the viewer to do that work.
Yeah, and absolutely, and that's where I went into my people pleasing mode, because I know all of the various reactions of like, it was too empathetic. We should, why didn't we talk to the victim and see the victim's impact on the family? And it's like, well, I think the show is very self-aware of that and made mention of that issue.
It did,
yeah. It's complex stuff, and I just realized, I fell into the same trap of like wanting to. One of my personal growth is wanting to not diminish anyone's lived experience. And yet there's a tension there of like of humanizing and seeing healing. Is like, the internet is so diverse, and you can't control how it's going to be interpreted.
I feel you, man. I'm an oldest child recovering people pleaser myself. And well, as we wrap up this episode, this has been so fascinating, Brendan. I just want to ask if there are any action items that you could leave listeners with. I've been ending all of our episodes in season 5 with actions that we can take to make the world a better place. So from your point of view, and given all the research that you've done, what would you recommend that we actually do in our daily lives to try to improve this situation?
I guess the most broad is that I think that we need to reevaluate our own relationships and the stories we've come to believe around emotions, masculinity, and change or healing in general around these topics. So like, our own relationship with emotions is like, if we want sons to be emotionally flourishing, and we know that teenage boys, one of their main reasons for suppressing their emotions is they don't want to burden other people, because maybe they don't want to tell people they're getting bullied at school, because like, then their parent freaks out and then they're caring more about the parent. Is that we have to increase our own emotional intelligence as parents. And Dr. Mark Brackett has a really like helpful list of skills to build with the acronym RULER. So recognizing and understanding your emotions, like what's going on, understanding the cause and consequence of emotions. And so I'd say that this is probably one of my biggest ones for men especially, but anyone, is like, cause and consequences of emotions doesn't mean like, oh, I'm angry, so then I punch something. It means, do you understand why that anger came out? Like, is that a primary emotion, or often it can be rooted in shame? Like, for instance, like, one of the quickest ways that's shame is the feeling like I am bad or something's wrong with me. Anger is a very more outward focused. And so if you don't want to feel negative about yourself, then outward expressions of anger can be really quick to protect you from feelings of shame. So you might not even recognize that shame came up for you in a moment, and it's just immediately anger.
Yeah.
So if your masculinity is threatened by what someone else says, or someone is actively trying to threaten your masculinity, calling you weak, calling you something, it's like, can you recognize, okay, there's this level of shame that comes up first, and then you can increase your capacity to recognize and sit with that shame, so it doesn't result in like a more harmful thing. Like, they've done a ton of research studies where they do threaten artificially. They threaten a man's masculinity by saying, oh, your answers were far more feminine, or you had answers, or your testosterone results came back and they're like much more feminine. And then their men are more likely in those types of studies to report higher levels of sexual partners in the past. They are more likely to lie about their height. They're more likely to demonstrate or show aggression as well. And one unique study, it prized apart the mechanism for that, is that in one study, they said you got outperformed by a woman. And for almost all of the men, their experiences of shame went up. But if the experiences of shame led to anger, then they were more likely to sexualize that fictitious woman that had outperformed them. But if they just like sat in their shame, um, and I don't know enough about like the debrief of that study of what came after, but they weren't more likely to sexualize that woman. So increasing our capacity to sit with distress, and I would say shame is one of the main emotions to target. Like if in an ideal world, I would want almost every adult to like just take one emotion per week in your journal and reflect on your relationship with this emotion. So it might cause you to do like a quick Google search or chat GPT of what is this emotion, and because if you don't know anything about the emotion, that might be hard. But like, okay, there's inward anger and there's outward anger. What's the relationship like with that? And just assessing all those things for ourselves would be a great place to start for building emotional intelligence. And then I have so many other things. But I would also, I guess, on this emotional side, is that I would encourage people to become emotional safe havens for themselves. It's like you might not have other people in your life, which sucks, to be emotionally expressive with, but can you start being curious about if you want to get to know yourself? That's probably been one of the most helpful reframes in my own counseling healing journey, is realizing, oh, I'm actually scared most days to meet myself. And it's like, oh, I don't want my children to grow up afraid to meet themselves. So like I have this like underpinning that like getting to meet myself is like something that I want to do. And I'm curious by the fact that I'm so resistant of getting to know parts of myself that I would rather not look at for various reasons.
Wow, that's powerful. And that, I mean, I think a byproduct of that, then, of doing that emotional work and knowing ourselves, is that we will be able to be better emotional safe havens for our children, right? And more emotionally intelligent to help them process their
Yeah, because
emotions.
so much is modeling.
Yes, yes,
Like
yes.
so much is modeling. And of
Yeah.
course, there's other strategies that are more targeted, but we can't get into all of this.
Yeah. Oh, that was awesome. That's a fantastic takeaway, Brendan. Thank you so much. Well, my last question is really quickly. Can you just tell us where listeners can find your work? Tell us any social media handles. If you have any books or upcoming books, tell us where people can find you.
Everything's from my website, www.remasculine.com. And my social media that I'm most active on is TikTok and Instagram with a similar username, remasculine or re.masculine. And if you sign up for my newsletter, you get some free resources for parents and teachers. And I do like monthly emails. I'm supposed to do more because apparently book publishers want you to increase your newsletter subscribers. So I need to work on that.
Awesome. Well, highly recommended. Dr. Brendan Kwiatkowski-Hartman, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. It was great talking with you, Amy.